It is time now for the keynote address of this conference, delivered by the Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce, Mr. John Denton. There will be a question and answer session that follows, which will be moderated by Ambassador-at-Large Professor Chan Heng Chee. May I now invite Secretary-General Denton and Ambassador Chan on stage, please.
Good afternoon. I hope you've had a good lunch. I know this is the session all of you have been waiting for, I've been told by members of the audience. Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce, John Denton, a dialogue with. Now, most of you know he's Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce. It's located in Paris. Now, Mr. Denton is also the person who created the International Business Advisory Group for WTO. He was invited by the Director General of WTO to join with ICC and to create this group. So I think we'll have a lot of questions on WTO for him later. But prior to joining the ICC, Mr. Denton is well known as a global business leader as well as a legal expert on trade and investment. And he is a very active and well-respected public servant from Australia. Mr. Denton, thank you so much for coming. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, actually, and congratulations to SBF for putting this together. Friends, I quote, "We have succeeded because we were willing to do the hard things, to face reality, to be pragmatic, to make tough decisions, and to stick with them." So said Lee Kuan Yew. Friends, it is no small thing to gather here in Singapore, a city forged not merely by men and markets, but by the will of a people who chose to rise through discipline and who stood firm in the face of every storm that history has thrown your way. As this nation marks 6 decades of independence, not in celebration of conquest, but of stewardship, we are summoned not only to look back upon a miraculous ascent, but to peer soberly into the troubled mists of what lies ahead. The theme of today's conference, Global City Singapore, SG60 and beyond, reminds us precisely of that. Friends, the world, once thought to be marching forward through strong international cooperation and clear frameworks of shared rules, is now deeply challenged. There was once a covenant between nations, the quiet agreement that trade, based on comparative advantage, would be our shared path to a more prosperous future. This is the foundational principle upon which the organization that I have the privilege to lead, the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, was established in 1919. For over a century, we have been relentless in the pursuit of our mission to enable business to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. However, that very covenant now fractures under the weight of uncertainty about the way forward, set against a backdrop of long-standing grievances, which, for far too long, we have failed to address at their core. Frustrated by the system's failure to tackle the root causes of their concerns, some key players in the global economy have begun to turn on the system itself, resorting to unilateral actions that increasingly defy established rules. This means that where once there was harmony, now there is confusion. Where once agreed rules governed, now power threatens to return as the highest law. As Prime Minister Wang once warned, if each nation becomes its own judge and national interest stands above shared principle, then it shall be the law of the jungle that reigns, and with it, the slow undoing of civilization. Friends, this is not rhetoric. This is the crossroads that we are living through. And let us be clear about the danger. The rise of unilateral trade restrictions and trade distortions under the guise of national defence, the crumbling of frameworks meant to resolve cross-border trade disputes with reason, the near paralysis of institutions once charged with setting the rules that govern global trade, these are not abstractions. They are, as PM Wong has aptly said, the seeds of the slow undoing of civilization. Should the rules-based order collapse, let no one say they were not warned. The poorest nations among us will suffer most. Entire regions will see their livelihood, trade, dry up. Livelihoods will vanish, not with a bang, but with a silence that follows exclusion and decay. Our recent research at the ICC shows that a collapse of the system governed by the WTO will result in a 33% drop in goods exports over a 5-year horizon. In some countries, this contraction could be as high as 45%. And given the strong relationship between trade and investment, a breakup of the system would have dire consequences for foreign direct investment as well, as rising uncertainty and trade costs undermine investor confidence. These figures are staggering. India and China would see their FDI inflows contract by 5.7% and 5% respectively. Even closer to Singapore, the inflow of FDI would shrink by 3.7% in Indonesia and by 3.2% in Vietnam. This projected decline in FDI flows would in turn have negative repercussions on trade-exposed countries' economic growth. We estimate that the long-term GDP loss associated with the dissolution of the system governed by the WTO would exceed 5% across the developing world, with countries like China, India, and Vietnam facing particularly severe impacts. Singapore, ever open and vulnerable to the tides of global fortune, already feels the chill winds of this gathering storm. But there is virtue in acting, even when the world does not, and that too is Singapore's legacy. At the International Chamber of Commerce, we see this moment not as a final act, but as a hinge of history, as the institutional representative of over 45 million companies in more than 170 countries, 70% of which are in the global south, enabling something like $17.5 trillion worth of economic activity every year. We feel the urgency to act with resolve. With conviction, we take up 3 tasks to leverage this inflection point. First, to de-escalate tensions through reason by promoting evidence-based trade policy and advocating against a full-blown trade war. Second, to stabilize cross-border trade through greater and better exploitation of existing tools and agreements, including on the financing and digitalisation of trade. And finally, to revitalize, yes, to revitalize the global trading system, ensuring it is fit for purpose for the 21st century. De-escalate, stabilize, revitalize. And in these labours, Singapore stands tall, not through might, but through clarity, not by imposing, but by convening, like today. Here is a nation that understands the art of balance, of rule and innovation, of state and enterprise, of tradition and transformation. The initiatives born here, paperless trade, digital standards, frameworks for regional prosperity, are not mere policy. They are expressions of a belief that the future need not be feared if only we have the courage to shape it together. It is no surprise then that the ICC has established our Digital Standards Initiative right here in Singapore to foster a globally aligned, standards-driven ecosystem that facilitates secure, smoother, cross-border trade. And what of the region and its trade blocs, of ASEAN, of RCEP, of CPTPP? These too are not accidents. They are the result of men and women who chose collaboration over conflict. Let us not treat them as conveniences, but as covenants. Stronger cooperation and integration among these forums holds significant promise for advancing regional prosperity. For instance, recent UN analysis indicates that deeper digitalisation of cross-border trade could reduce trade costs in South Asia by nearly 11%. potentially driving a 19% surge in exports. Still, such platforms require guardians. They demand vision. They require that leaders, and yes, the private sector too, not shrink from responsibility, but embrace it as our collective duty. So let us not grow complacent. Survey after survey shows how few businesses and communities truly benefit from agreements meant to uplift them. This tells us not only of bureaucracy or complexity, but of a deeper failure to connect ideals with daily life, agreements with reality. This is a failure we must amend. Yet, and hear this well, hope is far from lost, my friends. Regional integration and trade across Southeast Asia are already showing promising signs of a path forward. As a founding member of both the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, Singapore has consistently championed open rules-based trade across Asia and beyond. And as we chart the road ahead, this leadership will be more vital than ever. The speed and unity with which Asian leaders responded to the initial wave of reciprocal tariffs, crafting a joint statement and approach, was only possible thanks to decades of collaboration grounded on shared rules. This shared and shaped vision of prosperity, based upon mutual respect for each country's unique circumstances, shines as a beacon of cooperation in uncertain times. We see this reflected in the creation of RCEP as well. Formed amidst rising geo-economic tensions, RCEP's launch, uniting a broad coalition of governments under innovative frameworks and systems, was a milestone covering over 30% of global GDP. But in my recent discussions with senior trade officials from across the bloc, there was resounding affirmation not only for RCEP itself as a critical regional asset, but crucially for RCEP to be developed and better operationalized. Now more than ever, we must work together to enhance the implementation of RCEP and other free trade agreements to fully realize their opportunities they offer. This calls for continued principled political leadership. The same vision that built these systems must now guide us in operationalizing them. And this is precisely where the business community plays an essential role. We need deeper private sector engagement, both to help businesses unlock the benefits of these agreements and to ensure governments are responsive, adaptive, and committed to removing the barriers and bottlenecks felt across the economy. Friends, a recent survey by Singapore's Institute of Policy Studies revealed that only 29% of Singaporean firms have obtained a certificate of origin under at least one trade agreement. The reasons vary from compliance costs and minimum export thresholds to the sectoral scope of the agreements themselves. The private sector is evolving, innovating and adapting. It is time for trade policy and the global trading system to evolve in step. Whether through targeted Pathfinder initiatives with like-minded nations or through revitalized WTO, we must update the global trade rulebook to meet the needs of the 21st century and of the 21st century business models, especially those here in Singapore and across ASEAN. And if integration falters and commerce is reduced to a battlefield rather than a bridge to shared prosperity, then the edifice upon which Singapore and so many other open economies have built their future will crumble. Not from war, my friends, but from neglect. Even in these shadowed times, a light endures, not in speeches or treaties alone, but in the quiet labour of those who still believe, those who work to rebuild trust, repair what is torn, and rekindle an enduring dream that trade, when governed by rules, can be an instrument not just of prosperity but of peace. Despite daunting challenges, signs of progress are emerging, subtle, yet increasingly within reach. Flickering but firm, they reveal the world's potential to change course. At the WTO, reform is gaining some traction, backed by growing consensus on what must be repaired and that things must be repaired. Crucially, trade digitalisation, sustainable trade, and inclusive agreements are no longer viewed as luxuries. They are an essential pathway forward to resilience and equity. Governments, trade blocs, and international fora are speaking with renewed urgency, and now we are witnessing a rare convergence, a shared momentum to devolve and evolve global trade rules. A key breakthrough is the broadening support for a permanent moratorium on customs duties for electronic transmissions, critical to enable digital trade across borders. On sustainability, there's a groundswell building around trade's role in accelerating the green transition. This goes beyond policy. It's about aligning with global frameworks that make trade and finance compatible with sustainability. In the same vein, the next WTO Ministerial Conference in Cameroon presents a pivotal opportunity to achieve meaningful commitment for reform across multiple points. Disruption must not be mistaken for collapse. This is not a breakdown, this is a transformation, and if we respond with haste, not with haste, but with wisdom and unity, we can turn this moment of reckoning into one of renewal and a revitalization. Let us remember this. The future of Singapore, of Asia, of the world will not be written by fate. It will be written by those who dared to care. Let us not be idle as this world changes. Let us be its builders. Let us not settle for trade that enriches some while excluding many. Let us strive for a commerce that honours dignity, fosters peace, and binds us to one another. And let us, above all, reject fear and embrace the quiet strength of cooperation, of principle, of shared purpose. This is our path forward. Let us walk it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Denton, for that very thoughtful, cautiously optimistic, and practical speech, and its inspiration as well. Now, you have noted the changing patterns of trade and the morphing of globalization. This morning, everyone spoke about globalization and trade and the changing trade patterns. My question to you is, sitting as you do in Paris from Europe, how do you see globalization morphing globally? Will we see more trade or less trade with all these new patterns of regionalization? Will we see more investment or less investment? And let me throw another spanner in the works, which is there's a lot of talk about the US-China relationship possibly moving towards decoupling in trade. I think that danger, for me anyway, is sort of lessened now, given the talks, less of that talk. But we do see critical technologies and deep tech being bifurcated. There is decoupling there. How does decoupling of the US and China, deep tech and critical technologies affect our new globalization?
Wow, you've
Sorry.
packed a lot into that one simple question. That was, hey, just at a practical level on decoupling, I was in Beijing about 10 days ago, where I keynoted the Supply Chain Expo with Jensen Huang. Now, if ever there is a counterpoint to decoupling, it is the existence of someone like Jensen Huang and NVIDIA standing with one leg in the US and another leg in China. And I think we've all read the statements by the US administration, and particularly by the Secretary of Treasury, that there is no interest in decoupling from China. But as you say, there are elements in which the competition for economic superiority in the 21st century is giving rise to reservations and inhibitions on access too. And let's not forget, I mean, there is a competition going on for economic superiority and supremacy in the 21st century. And that battle is joined. And that battle is between the US and China. But by the way, it doesn't mean we're all bystanders. And I think, as I tried to express in my remarks to you, and I frame those remarks in an exhortatory way, because there are things we can do. We are not bystanders in this process. The point I have been making in Washington, in Brasilia, in South Africa, in Jakarta, in China, in India, and everywhere I go, is that the US only accounts for 13% of global trade. The 87% is content to be governed by rules which enable trade to operate. We are not bystanders. By working together, and I think one reason I'm very pleased to be in ASEAN and in Singapore, a central point of ASEAN, is because not only of the critical nature of the maintenance of rules to enable the supply chain system, which has given birth to such opportunity here to continue, but the existential crisis that if it fails and the system collapses, what it'll do to global GDP. So you asked the question about globalisation and will there be more trade or less trade. In a way, this is all in our hands. We are not passive observers here. We are active players. I do not believe that globalisation as we have seen it will be the globalisation that will exist in 2030. It will be a different form. Globalisation is in a process of transformation. I also believe there will be more trade. I mean, the demographics of Southeast Asia, 60% of the world's middle class will be in Southeast Asia in 2030. Southeast Asia is shifting from an export economy to a consumption economy, but it will require trade, investment for all that to happen. So I don't see fate, I see this as a hinge point. I actually think we have agency here, and obviously I speak here on behalf of the International Chamber of Commerce, but we are not an observer, we are an active participant. We enable $17.5 trillion worth of economic activity. We want that to continue, and part of that, we know that at the moment the level of uncertainty around is placing a tax on economic activity. We want to lower that level of uncertainty and create a framework which actually enables economic activity in the 21st century, and the rule book that has been used in the WTO as it governs this system is actually out of date with the system that we have now. It never envisaged the digital economy, which is why I celebrate a little bit the Indonesia change of heart over the maintenance of the moratorium on against tariffs being placed on digital, on data transfers. Was my question as long as your answer as long as your question?
Longer. Yeah, I could pursue that, but let me go on to another question which I think the audience would be interested in. We had a lot of discussion on the WTO in the earlier session, whether it was relevant, whether it's worth saving. Now, you are now in the WTO helping Ngozi, reform WTO. Tell me, how and where can WTO be reformed? In what ways?
Well, let me be very clear. I'm talking about revitalization of the system. I'm here to defend the system, not the WTO. The WTO is an institution, okay? And the role of the WTO is to help curate and govern that system. And the WTO is not an abstract. It actually comprises the members, the member states. So I just want to be very clear that the system is what I want. However, the WTO must morph to actually ensure effective governance of that. That must be, and that's what we need to work on here. What is I think, a consequence of the disruption is that it's giving pause to systemically important economies who are participants in the system governed by the WTO to rethink some of their fundamental positions which have stopped the effective revitalization of the system. The reality is that when the WTO came into existence, it was only a year and a half after the internet had gone into the public domain, and it was before payment systems were joined up to the internet, so we didn't actually have e-commerce. And that's not yesterday, that's many, many years ago. And they still have not, the member states have still not upgraded the rule book to give a reflection of that in the way in which they govern the system which operates. E-commerce operates, it's just that it's not properly governed through the WTO. And that is not the fault of the Secretariat, that's the fault of the member states. And that's why what I'm focusing on at the moment is helping member states find the space to rethink some of their positions that have stopped the functioning of the system and actually have given rise to legitimate grievances. And I heard before on the panel, there are legitimate grievances about the way in which the system operated. It operated on two heroic assumptions. One is that the benefits of trade would benefit all. Well, it didn't. It did not. The other is that systemically important economies who entered into the WTO would reform their economic systems to align with a market-based system. That was part of the assumption. Both assumptions, both heroic, proved to be wrong or overly optimistic.
Now, you know, what we've seen happening since this year, Liberation Day, the world was delivered a great shock. In terms of trade, is a paradigm shift. Do you see your WTO members, countries, and just businesses realizing this moment and using this, to act, and has this shock stimulated them to pay greater attention to what they, as you said, sort of let things drift for a long time?
Great question. I mean, the reality is the bandwidth of politicians and of policymakers is not endless. What's actually happened, the shock has mesmerized people, and they've become completely fixated with their bilateral relationship with the US and have neglected the reality of the 87% I was talking about before. That's the job of ours, of the ICC, of the business community, say, guys, we actually have to pay attention to where the value can be created here. The price of access to the US market has gone up. Mm-hmm. Work with that, understand that, don't turn it into a global trade war. What you need to do is look at the system we've got, see what more value we can get out of it, and there's lots of things identified before, just the way in which RCEP operates, not enough people use it, and then work to revitalize the system. That's focusing not on the bilateral relationship, but on the global relationship. What I'm told is that they don't want to do anything that will annoy the US. But this is ridiculous because the US has actually made it quite clear that it will act in its interests. Well, shouldn't we be acting in our interests, which is preserving the system? They've never said they want the system to collapse. They've simply said they want to enable access to their interests. They have a president and administration democratically elected, clearly on the basis that tariffs would be placed, and we can talk about the detail of it all. I'm just being shorthand. Shorthand here, so it should be no surprise to anyone. But we've got to focus on the whole. And what's happened at the moment is politicians and policymakers have been mesmerized on the bilateral and have been neglecting it. What we've been doing over the last couple of months by focusing on the global action around the 87% is actually, and by providing real data about the economic damage of the lost, we've been able to start shifting people's attention to, we better do something about this. And that's what I was at the BRICS Plus group in Rio, talking there. The BRICS Plus group, of course, has its own political dimension, but one thing is very clear if you look at the materials, they are very focused on maintaining and revitalizing the multilateral trading system. You go to the G20 process led by South Africa, this is a key part of what's going on there. So we're actually getting that momentum because the biggest losers out of this will be developing and emerging economies. And on top of the collapse of the development assistance model, this would be devastating, and that's in no one's interest.
Right. I'll ask one last question, and then I'll open the floor to the audience. My last question is on digital trade. Much has been said about that, and it is a way forward, and it will promote, digital trade will promote greater trade once we, fix the rules and so on. I fully agree, but I worry, and I wonder if you do, that this will exacerbate the differences between the lower income countries and the upper income, middle income countries, the digitally ready and those that are not.
Well, it's an understandable concern. I mean, I know we're very active in developing emerging economies in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even in Eastern Europe, and many would say that they were yet to see what was promised to them by the improvements in telcos, etc., and by opening up their economies to technology. However, it's a justifiable concern, but it's not a realistic outcome, because if you do the work, as we've done in creating the Digital Standards Initiative, we've also done the economic analysis around it. What it will do is lower the costs of trading, make it more democratic in a way, more inclusive, and increase trade. So I understand the concerns based on historical analogies with what happened with tech, but they're actually misplaced, which is why it's so important for organizations like the ICC to be involved in this discussion, because we bring that voice. We also help that voice understand better that what it's shouting out about should actually be redirected to shout in support of. Digital trade is inclusive trade. If you want to get money to women in saris in India, doing it through digital transfers is the best way of doing it. It actually improves economic opportunities.
Right. Thank you. Now, are there questions from the floor? Have I got bad eyes, but I don't see people at the mic?
I think I'll
yes,
ask the questions. Since you mentioned the BRICS as well,
Can you identify?
sorry, Matthew Ting from Silent Foundation. My question is on, you talked about focusing on the 87% rather than just the 13% and the bilateral relationships. But the problem is that the 13% is threatening the other 87% and say that, if you, for example, the BRICS, right, if you seek an alternative currency or if you try to trade with other members, I'm going to sanction you and so on and so forth. So can we actually break away from this 13% and not be fixated about it when they're saying such things? Or do we have to sort of like work out some other way?
Well, just look as evidence to the contrary, the change in trade patterns since Trump won. You look at the increase in South-South trade. You look at the increase in China-South trade. This is actually not diminishing. This is actually increasing. So I think that the idea that the 13% can dictate the terms of trade to the other 87% is actually fatalistic. It's actually not correct because the counterpoints are very clear. This is happening anyway. South-South trade will continue.
Right. Whilst you are thinking, let me pop another question. And this is it. You mentioned in your speech, Mr. Denton, that businesses are not really taking up many of the benefits that are offered in the agreements, and you cited that in Singapore we have such a low percentage of those who applied for the Rules of Origin certificate, which is from an IPS survey. How do you think, in fact, we can explain intricacies to the businesses? I know that when I was in Washington and looking through the negotiation of the bilateral free trade agreement, I was the ambassador in place there. I always worried that our businesses would not understand what we are negotiating for them and would not grasp that to take advantage. Whereas I can see American businesses lobbying away their congressmen, the administration, so they know what they are asking for and they know what will be in the trade agreement. Do you see this as a general problem of business? And how can we help businesses understand the benefits?
Well, I'll give you a very practical example. If you look at the arrangements that are being entered into in North America between the US, Mexico, and Canada, and you see the dramatic increase in tariffs that will be proffered onto goods transferred across. But you'll also notice that those goods which are compliant with the USMCA will not attract any tariffs. The reality right now is that something like 49% of goods are actually from Mexico are non-compliant. And 39% or 42% are non-compliant from Canada. I may have got the actual numbers not exactly right, but that's the dimension. And why is that? It's not because business people are stupid. It's because of the compliance costs. The reality is that what could happen before was that you paid an extra 2.5% as a tariff, and therefore you were not subject to the compliance required. And so most people simply agreed to do that, okay? Now, there's a real pressure to actually get your goods compliant with, because most of the goods were, but the actual compliance costs were too high. So what we're looking at, and this is going to be technological, this is going to have to be a technologically driven intervention to lower the compliance costs to actually enable those goods to go across. So what that tells you in RCEP and other places where the principal users of RCEP, the Japanese and Korean businesses, and it's really for their dealings with China, is that we have to facilitate the whole issue of how you determine rules of origin, certificates of origin, and that's something that will actually ease and make it more possible. And that's where governments need to work with the private sector, but with agencies like customs to actually trifurcate this to resolve those issues. It's possible to do, but it hasn't been done. Agreements have been set and forget. What we're really saying now is if you want to function in this new world, you've got to pay attention to rules of origin, certificates of origin, but you're also going to need to invest in technology to facilitate all that, and there needs to be trusted certification, which is where the ICC can help.
Now, you are in Europe, are there practices in Europe now, good practices, where businesses are made to understand the availability of these trade agreements and what the benefits are and the provisions? Or do they, in fact, know themselves? Because we could import some of those ideas.
I think you can generate the ideas here. I wouldn't be looking into Europe for best practice on this. I think the answers lie here. The answer lies in actually translating the talk about trade tech into reality and actually giving benefits to companies. And that's something that we all need to focus on. Europe doesn't lead on this. No one's leading on this. This is an opportunity. This is why we're centering a lot of our attention, particularly on stabilizing and revitalizing the system in this region. This region has economic reasons to act. And one of those is actually to facilitate the existing arrangements like RCEP, CPTPP, to make them more effective. And that will get more goods flowing across borders.
I don't see anyone around. Are there questions? Yes, Gillian.
Good afternoon. I'm Gillian from the Institute of Policy Studies. My question to Secretary General Denton is this. You talked about how the situation today may cause a sort of halt in FDI and certainly FDI into this region. So among your peers and the people you're speaking to at the Chamber, what in practical terms are companies looking for when they're sort of thinking next 10 years, 20 years? What in practical terms are they looking for in order to decide that they should land in the region here? Of course, you talked about very high level multilateral, minilateral deals, but what in practical terms are they looking for? Thank you.
Great question. We're not seeing the same drift in FDI in developed members of ASEAN. We are seeing dramatic drift in FDI in developing and emerging economies. We've seen quite a significant downturn now, and that will continue. And that, of course, is now coupled with the collapse of the development assistance-led model. But what that tells you, again, is not desperation. There's actually things that can be done. These are the economies and the polities need to actually focus on creating enabling environments and clear signals about the investability of the economies over which they govern. And this is something that is quite challenging, to be really frank. I just co-chaired the private sector dimension of the Finance for Development Conference in Seville. And the point I made to leaders there is that there will be no major pledges from developed economies to support developing economies. Get that out of your heads. What you need to do is think about, in the absence of that, how you create economic activity. And that's, of course, creating environments to allow the private sector to function properly and to look at some systemic inhibitors to that. For example, the way in which macroprudential regulatory frameworks inhibit investment. These need to be all aligned to actually enable that investment. The macroprudential regulatory frameworks that inhibit investment actually came out of the global financial crisis and are governed by the Financial Stability Board. One of the rules, I'm sure many of you know this, means that a company cannot hold a credit rating higher than the economy in which they operate. And now, of course, that was done in 08-09 in order to protect us from what had happened before. But now that same rule applies, and the economies are seeing sovereign downgrades as a consequence of climate change, COVID, the entrails of 08, 09 as well. And there's been no make relevant or make contemporary that rule. That actually inhibits foreign direct investment into projects because the cost of capital is higher. It actually stops access to finance for private sector companies which run perfectly good businesses but can't get access to trade finance because it's been retrenched. That's the sort of thing that will actually provide finance for development. That will actually create the environment for foreign direct investment. These are the sort of things that we're looking at.
I'm a political scientist, so I can't resist this question. You talk of the enabling environment and the rules that would be necessary. In today's world, how much do you think geopolitics will play a part in the decision of investment decisions?
Well, I'm also an investor. It plays a part, but I think what you're seeing is geopolitics morph into geoeconomics.
Yes.
You see quite a different alignment of interests there. One thing that's very interesting is when nations talk about security now, it cannot only be about defense security, it needs to be around economic security. I mean, we do a lot of work in Ukraine. In fact, I've visited there 4 times since the war. We keep the private sector effectively functioning there. And the reason we do that is, as we explain, is that this is the economic front.
Yes.
Imagine the rebuilding of Ukraine if the private sector was completely collapsed. So keeping it functioning is actually good for the future, but also it's good for morale, for keeping the actual energy moving as well, and it's very useful for the economy.
Is that a, yes, oh. Yes, it's Wendy. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Okay, just go closer. I wanted to ask you about the MFN principle and whether you think it's dead or on life support. And the reason I'm asking is through these latest Trump trade agreements, not only is the US violating its MFN obligations, but now other countries that have reached these agreements with us apparently look to be doing the same. And just more generally, do you think this MFN principle has kind of outlived its usefulness? Thanks.
MFN.
It's a great question. It's one I had to do an interview with the BBC this morning, and it was one that I was thinking about they're going to ask as well. And I was going to use the term it's on life support, so maybe I was channeling or you were channeling me at the same time. I think it is on life support. And I think that the issue of whether it's run its day, I don't think so, because the reality is comparative advantage is one of those iron laws. It's not going to be wished away. And you think about how businesses have established their investments, their supply chains, their value chains. They're not going to be unwound that easily. In fact, the incentives of business are actually often misaligned with the political incentives before politicians go into your life as a political scientist. So I do think it's on life support because you see more countries, actually curiously led by the UK, if you think about the arrangement they entered into, which was actually, there's a clear breach of MFN in that. A week later, they issued their national trade strategy, which celebrated the maintenance of MFN, so kind of go figure. So that tells you that there's still an interest in the latter. And also, when you look at the way in which supply chains operate and you look at the way in which open markets have functioned, MFN is a fundamental principle. But there is a peculiarity, I think, in the WTO rules. There are probably more detailed-oriented people here than I am, that with the most recent EU arrangement, it is possible to argue that where they are going in terms of 0-0 might lead to 0-0 across all Europe in terms of tariffs, which apparently could still be aligned with WTO rules and could be the perfect expression of a pure MFN, which is there are no tariffs anywhere. That might be a little optimistic. I think you're right that one of the options here is life support. That's probably where it's sitting at the moment.
Right. I want to get back to Oh, sorry. Yes, please. Yes, there's a question there.
Good afternoon. My name is Chloe and I'm from Temasek JC. So in last week's conference, the panel noted how firms have difficulty utilizing FTAs effectively. And the previous session also explained about the spaghetti bowl effect. So could you share your insights on how to better engage firms to counter this? Thank you.
So I didn't quite hear the question. Engage the...
Can you repeat it again?
Could you share your insights on how to better engage firms to counter how
Firms, is it? Firms.
firms?
How to better engage firms to counter?
Because firms have difficulty utilizing FTA.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, I think part of it is accessibility. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I mean, things are written and set and forget, but you know, any good policy needs to actually have an execution or implementation plan. But one of the problems is, and maybe this is not a Singapore problem, but it is a problem in other economies, where the actual negotiating playbook is developed without the private sector. And it's actually policy players. I mean, like any good policy, the end users need to be involved in the design of the policy and increasing that engagement. I think one of the exhortations I make in my speech today is actually engaging the private sector much more in the policy formation here, and that's something which is critical. And the business politicians will often argue that it's very hard. The private sector has its interests and they can be selfish. But the reality is that the private sector is the key driver of economic opportunity. There must be an engagement with the private sector in development of negotiating frameworks. And frankly, if I can just riff into another area that I spend a lot of time on the energy transition, particularly in the COP process, one of the disasters of the COP process has been the inability of the negotiators to effectively engage with that group which will fundamentally pay for the energy transition, which is the private sector. And the idea that people are negotiating around terms to do with carbon markets without actually understanding how the market will operate and not being informed effectively and properly and in real time on the market chilling effects of some of their decisions, or the market enhancing effects by having direct engagement with the private sector, is slowed the whole process down.
Yes. You mentioned again, you know, the engagement with business in policy making. Governments should do that. I know in Singapore we are trying now, you know, but I don't know whether it's the British system, you know, and I know in Australia you are bound by that. Interests have a role, but we don't let interests overplay. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, in America, I saw interests are legitimate and lobbies are legitimate. So there's a lot of interest and engagement of business in policy making.
I mean, it's a fair point, but it's actually overcooked. I mean, think of a global problem that can be solved without the private sector. You won't find any. So we have to find an effective mechanism. And actually what we've done, and I'll be very frank here, what we've done with the ICC is to reshape and transform the ICC so that it could play that role. We are a not-for-profit, for-purpose institution, 170 countries, 70% in the global south. We are the most inclusive voice. We do not have a selfish interest. Our purpose is to enable business worldwide to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. I have done that. We have done that to answer that very question. We do have legitimacy, and we therefore have a right to be at the table.
I think we are getting to that. You know, it is overcoming what was traditional in our system. Well, thank you very much. It's a good note to end on because we're here with business, and business has a legitimate voice and should play its role in helping government formulate policy. Take that to the government, Janadas.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dante.